good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for today's web conference on UNESCO World Heritage Interpretation, which has been jointly organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and the Korean National Commission for UNESCO. I'm Jin Sung-jeon, the Director of the Culture Division at the Korean National Commission for UNESCO. And I will be moderating the first half of today's program. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few things so you know how to participate in today's program. First, for those Korean audience, English-Korean simultaneous interpretation will be provided for today's program. So please make sure that you have a correct language setting on your screen. Second, if you have any questions during the presentations or discussion that follow, please send them to us through YouTube chat box. We will collect them and pass them to the moderator of the open discussion sessions. Dear participants, today we will be discussing the role of heritage interpretations and how inclusive heritage interpretation can facilitate the protections of heritage while promoting the rights of those who are less heard from. There will be 3 presentations by distinguished group of experts, and they will be followed by open discussions and Q&A. Before getting into that, I would like to first invite Mr. Tae-ho Lee, Second Vice Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea, to give us his opening remarks.
It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2020 International Conference on UNESCO World Heritage Interpretation. I would like to extend my special thanks to the eminent experts and scholars who are virtually with us today to share their insights and outlooks on heritage interpretation. It is unfortunate that we could not receive you in Korea as planned because of the fast-changing public health situation around the world. But thanks to the advancement of communication technology, I'm pleased to see you all connected despite different time zones and locations. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has left us with many challenges and problems that we have to deal with or live with. In particular, the devastating impact on the cultural sector has weakened the overall cultural ecosystem around the world. Given the role of culture as a means to lift the spirits of the people in times of crisis, I believe UNESCO's programs, especially those of its cultural sector, are still valid and indeed grow even more relevant in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this regard, I appreciate UNESCO's prompt action to provide support for the recovery and resilience of the cultural sector by launching SNS campaigns such as Share Our Heritage and Share Culture. I'm pleased to note with you that the Jeju Island of Korea, home to numerous tangible and intangible heritages, participated in the campaign of Share Our Heritage as a kick-off by introducing its proud heritages to the global audience. This initiative proved effective to boost the morale of participants and to make people feel connected with each other beyond borders. We clearly understood once again the importance of culture in rebuilding trust and solidarity. Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs also sent out a message of hope and resilience with the Stay Strong and Trust campaigns, which wish everyone strength and health in the fight against COVID-19. Dear experts, since 2016, the Korean government has hosted an annual conference on the issue of heritage interpretation with the objective of raising international awareness of its concept and significance. Inclusive and participatory interpretation holds great importance as key element of World Heritage conservation and management. The definition of heritage is shifting from an exclusive focus on its material forms to a deeper analysis of the social role it can play. When we begin to see heritage as a social process, we can embrace a wide range of values and multiple narratives embedded in heritage, regardless of whether it is positive or negative aspects of human history. There is also growing recognition of the need to encompass stories coming from the full range of groups interacting with the site, the local communities, indigenous peoples, minorities, and all others who share memories of the site. This is important because such inclusive heritage interpretation can help future generations understand the full history and diverse stories surrounding heritage. It is our duty to pass on to them a comprehensive and inclusive interpretation of our heritage. Along with this change, the significance of genuine dialogue and consultations among different communities becomes more viable, especially when there are differing and even conflicting meanings of a heritage site. The Ramelsberg Mine Museum, inscribed as World Heritage in 1992, shows a good practice in heritage interpretation. The museum maintains comprehensive documentation of the reality of the life and suffering of those who were forced to work in the mines, and shows this to the visitors through a permanent exhibition. By doing so, the museum remembers the victims and presents the full history of heritage to the visitors in a balanced manner. I hope we can hear more on this interpretation from Dr. Gerhard Lenz, Director of Ramelsberg Mine Museum, who will join us today. The main theme of today's conference, rights-based approaches in heritage interpretation, is therefore very relevant in that inclusive heritage interpretation can facilitate the protection and promotion of human rights of people whose voices need to be heard and remembered. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has painfully reminded us of how easily we can fall victim to ignorance, suspicion, and disinformation that breeds hate, mistrust, and discrimination. It is therefore our shared responsibility to start reconnecting people and restoring trust and solidarity at all levels of our social structures, local communities, countries, regions, and the world. And I believe the answer lies in the two keywords we have before us: comprehensiveness and inclusiveness. With that in mind, I hope today's conference will give us a valuable opportunity to pool our wisdom to find a right path to achieve that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Now I'm pleased to invite Mr. Kwang-ho Kim, the Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, to give us some welcoming remarks.
Good evening and good morning to all our guests and speakers. I am Kwang-ho Kim, the Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, a co-organizer of the 2020 International Conference on UNESCO World Heritage Interpretation. It is our great pleasure to welcome you again to this conference and to be connected with you across the globe in these unprecedented circumstances caused by the COVID-19. Last year in Seoul, we invited international experts in the field of World Heritage and had a chance to cast light on the intangible aspects of the tangible heritage sites. Lively discussions at the time had led us to an important conclusion. Heritage is a process of multiple people creating their own connections with a site over time, inevitably making the heritage multivocal. We are gathered again today in hopes to witness where the speakers and discussants of this year's conference may take us from here under the theme of rights-based approaches in heritage interpretation. In 2015, a policy document was adopted by the 20th General Assembly of the States Parties to the World Heritage Convention. It was the result of collective efforts made by many stakeholders in order to integrate a sustainable development perspective into the processes of the World Heritage Convention. This document highlights the need to incorporate the full range of groups interacting with heritage to achieve inclusive social development. Such a perspective acknowledges that the local and concerned communities, indigenous peoples, and various minorities all play an important role in the implementation of the convention. I believe that our consistent attempt to include diverse narratives into heritage interpretation may also contribute to realization of such needs. We would love to invite you to join us as well in these next steps we take in order to promote rights of those less heard from, starting by staying tuned to today's conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Lastly, we have received a short video message from Dr. Mathilde Ressler, the director of UNESCO World Heritage Center, conveying her warm congratulations.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very happy to address you today from UNESCO headquarters here in Paris. I sincerely regret not being able to join the online meeting. The pandemic has disrupted every aspect of our life and our professional agenda has not been spared. But I wanted to say a few words about this important event via this video message. First of all, I would like to express UNESCO's appreciation to the Republic of Korea for organizing this event. The Republic of Korea is among our most important partners in the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. And I take this opportunity to thank the State Party for its financial contributions in the context of the reflection of sites of memory and supporting the implementation of the convention in the Asia and Pacific region, especially through a dedicated Funds in Trust Corporation. An online information meeting dedicated to the reflection on sites of memory will be held on 18th January 2021. On this occasion, I would like to remind the participants that the core concept of World Heritage is to protect and promote the shared heritage of all of humanity and to make it accessible as much as possible to all people. I would also like to emphasize that heritage should never be exclusive, but always inclusive, and that the exceptional framework provided by the 1972 Convention should allow for the development of friendship, trust, and cooperation between all state parties. The topic of this event assumes a particular meaning given the current circumstances, the difficult situation that the world has been facing since the early months of 2020 has led to multiple consequences affecting the conservation of heritage in different ways. For example, this crisis caused the closure of World Heritage sites, including all museums, which are part of the visitor's experience and ensure better interpretation. Museums are not mere depositories of works of art and artifacts, as stipulated in the UNESCO 2015 recommendation concerning the protection and promotion of museums and collections, their diversity and their role in society. Museums represent what is most precious and meaningful to cultures and peoples and play a critical role in promoting cultural tourism and understanding diverse societies. The need to protect and preserve World Heritage is a concern for the international community, as natural or human-made damage and destruction of our heritage is seen as a major threat to the cultures on which the history of civilization is built. The outstanding universal value of natural and cultural heritage reflect the link between the tangible and the intangible heritage, making them unique and irreplaceable and making their conservation essential for our future. Heritage is a complex notion to define. Determining what heritage is and to whom something is considered to be heritage is a rather subjective exercise which depends upon individuals, groups, and communities who in various ways have identified themselves with that heritage. World Heritage properties can be seen as the result of human natural instinct to associate themselves with their natural and cultural environment through and the primordial predisposition to preserve the creative expressions of humankind in a specific setting. If heritage is interpreted as a representation of voices that speak from the past, a cultural discourse of heritage that constructs that narrative of heritage would necessarily stem from the fundamental aspect of cultural diversity. The controversial practice of heritage is one of the ways in which society constructs itself through its collective social memory. These stories and related interpretations of each and every individual and family in society converge into a single but coherent narrative, which ultimately becomes a tradition. Then intervenes the operation of selective tradition, that is the official narrative of heritage made by relevant institutions with the authority to do so. In this way, the selective consecration of episodes of culture is defined into a tradition which corresponds to the current interests and values of a society. In this ongoing process, heritage interpretation is critically significant. In this context, I would also like to recall that much of the work has already been done on defining what interpretation is, and that its core principles are outlined in the 2008 ICOMOS Charter for the Interpretation Presentation of Cultural Heritage Sites, where it is defined as the full range of potential activities intended to heighten public awareness and enhance the understanding of a cultural heritage site. When sustainability has become a key action of our times, with the adoption of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Agenda, it is important to highlight that interpretation can contribute to the sustainable conservation of World Heritage Sites, as it encourages a global understanding of property's outstanding universal value and sense of ownership, and therefore encourages participation of all, especially local communities, in the protection, management, and presentation of cultural natural heritage, thereby ensuring that its relevance is never lost. In closing, let me once again thank the Republic of Korea for the organization of this workshop and for bringing attention to this important question, providing a platform for international exchange. The World Heritage Center will continue to assist states parties and the World Heritage Committee in addressing issues of sites of memory and their place in the World Heritage System, and in devising possible strategies for their interpretation and presentation. I wish you a very fruitful discussion of the new challenges in interpretation for World Heritage, and I look forward to hearing about the results of this meeting. Thank you very much for your attention and for your collaboration.
As we announced, we will move on to our first presentation by Professor Peter Bill Larsen. Professor Larsen is currently lecturing at the University of Geneva, addressing the issues of environmental governance and heritage and transboundary conservations. His recent publication addresses the issues of world heritage and human rights and world heritage and sustainable development. So today, he will share with us his thoughts on right-based approaches in heritage interpretations. So please welcome Professor Larsen. Over to you, Professor.
A key issue, of course, becomes what are the justifications and needs and requirements for considering a rights-based approach to World Heritage interpretation. Indeed, we might think of the four WH, who is involved in World Heritage interpretation, which values, which premises, and with what outcomes are the kinds of questions that are relevant to consider in the context of rights-based approaches to heritage interpretation. So indeed, a starting point is what we might say winterpretation is about asking the right questions, but it's also about building new skills, building new capacity areas, and indeed thinking about rights-based standards to move forward on this. So next slide, please. So indeed, whether we want it or not, World Heritage interpretation does take place. And we also know it as a very powerful avenue of action, which can be empowering, but can also be shaped by the powerful. There is a risk, as we know, that vulnerable voices may get lost in the World Heritage interpretation process. There are multiple voices. Some voices are more heard than others. So indeed, a question in terms of inclusiveness is, how do we level the playing field? How do we create space for more different voices? How do we end up in having indeed more balancing of the voices involved? And human rights aim to do exactly that. By engaging with rights-based approaches in World Heritage interpretation, we can start thinking about how to balance heritage interpretation and perhaps also resolving conflict. As also mentioned by a number of the previous speakers, human rights-based approaches today are a requirement in the World Heritage Sustainable Development Policy. So whether we want to or not, this is part of the way that states parties are increasingly trying to rethink how to operationalize and build linkages between human rights standards and World Heritage standards as such. Next slide, please. So very briefly here, as time is short, as also mentioned, this policy commitment essentially is about upholding, respecting, and contributing to the implementation of the full range of international human rights standards. So again, we see here clearly UNESCO again being a forum where connections are made to the wider field of international standards. And this includes indeed an emphasis on that human rights should be taken into account in the full cycle of World Heritage processes, which of course means not just the designation process, the nomination process, but also what comes afterwards. And the aim there is to ensure that World Heritage and management as such is compatible and supportive of human rights. So there's a whole strong emphasis here on decision-making, monitoring, and evaluation that emphasizes this effective and equitable involvement and participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. It also emphasizes cross-culturally sensitive approaches to the interpretation of World Heritage properties, which again open up for important opportunities to take into account rights-based angles. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the 4WH, the 4 would involve who is involved in World Heritage interpretation, which values on which premises, and with what outcomes. This puts a lot of potential, indeed a lot of interesting opportunities for synergy building in an emphasis on rights-based approaches in the World Heritage interpretation field. So a core element here is indeed that people move from being objects of heritage making, or heritage only being the field of heritage making expertise and folklore, towards having people as subjects of identity, decision making, and recognizing people as rights holders. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, World Heritage interpretation then involves thinking around asking the right questions. Who is involved? Whose heritage is concerned? Which values? Which premises and processes? When we talk about who is involved, if you look all the way at the top of this graphic that I've tried to make here, who is involved? Are we engaging both rights holders and duty bearers? Are we actually empowering different actors, rights holders, to engage in interpretation, or are we limiting voices to the few? Which values are we considering? Do we recognize the rights of different actors to have different multiple values? And to what extent are the connections made between these multiple values and the outstanding universal values so cherished and emphasized in the World Heritage context? Finally, which premises and which process? What are the premises and what is the process that we actually engage in when undertaking interpretation? Are we limited to the voices of the few? Is it only emphasized by certain agendas, or are we again open for an interpretation agenda and an interpretation process that opens up for multiple angles? I would here like to emphasize a few elements that we often see come up in rights-based discourse. One, for example, would involve the modality and right to free, prior, informed consent in terms of setting the outstanding universal value, but it's also perhaps about using interpretation as a way of redressing legacies of exclusion. And there, indeed, the rights-based approach would open up for a space to say, if there are grievances, if there are histories of injustice, if there are histories of rights violation, how can the interpretation process be used to redress and reconcile and create a more inclusive interpretative space? This also connects to the last point about the outcomes and the wider effects. So when we go through the interpretation process, what are the narratives and forms of interpretation we end up with? Is there indeed wide consensus and consent to the kinds of narratives and forms of interpretation? And the question there is, of course, how all this also affects wider rights of indigenous and local communities in that process, for example. So the space here that I'm trying to show is also the multiple avenues of action when we adopt rights-based approaches. Next slide, please. This, I think, is an important opportunity and challenge for us in the heritage community, but it also involves new skills and new capacity areas. Very often, our ability to think about and recognize multiple layers of values and significance are not always there. We tend to see a given heritage from a very narrow, outstanding universal value perspective, and it's very often difficult to shift from the expert realm towards a multi-stakeholder dialogue. My experience from engaging with heritage professionals has been that there's very much openness to this, but there's also acknowledgement that this requires new skills and new capacity areas. Now, one of the challenging areas there is the difficulty of dealing with a potential resistance to multiple values and complexity, and especially dealing with difficulties, legacies of conflict, or legacies of rights violations is not easy. It's much easier, of course, to talk about positive values, but indeed we need the skills and we need the capacity to be able to engage in the World Heritage arena also when it intersects with past histories of injustice, when there are conflicting values, and we need the tools to actually build inclusivity in that respect. Next slide, please. So I would like to conclude with that we have a huge potential here to move towards a rights-based standard for World Heritage interpretation. And in a sense, the building blocks are there. We have the commitment in the World Heritage Convention, its sustainable development policy, increasingly also in the operational guidelines to adopt rights-based standards. That's one building block. We also spoke about the importance of capacity and new skills. And finally, I would say we need to think about establishing enabling conditions for states parties, for countries that engage with this, to clearly understand what rights are about and how to move forward. For that to happen, we need to think about better guidance for states parties on what criteria, what are the relevant standards, and also what are practical approaches for rights-based interpretation. Now, this is what's important to emphasize here is that this concerns both new nominations, dossiers, the development of dossiers, as it concerns existing sites. Let me say a few words about existing sites. Of course, we now have much more than 1,000 sites on the World Heritage List. And some of these sites indeed continue to demonstrate issues of some level of conflict, and there are also issues to unresolved rights issues. So there's important emphasis also now in the operational guidelines, in fact, also to explore redress. In other words, I think there's a clear avenue for action also to engage in more reconciliatory approaches in existing World Heritage sites. And in that respect, rights play an important role. one of the elements there is indeed for the World Heritage community to be much more explicit and have a focus on conflict and human rights impact analysis when they embark on heritage destination. While we all are fascinated and admirative by the important heritage at stake, we also need to understand that it's located in specific social and economic context with risks in terms of conflict, with risks in terms of human rights. So therefore, moving towards what we might say a fair and equitable multi-stakeholder dialogue, this is the language we often use, involves clear emphasis on engaging rights holders and indeed engaging them in their interpretative process, and the outcomes of interpretation is fundamental. So some of the modalities we might think of here is actually thinking about ensuring that there is free, prior, and informed consent to key value statements and interpretation plans. These are some of the elements one can consider when one starts having a system of checks and balances, which again, for me, the key element is now where we are today, is creating clear and enabling conditions for states parties to actually effectively build rights-based interpretation. So I would like to stop here. I think my time is up, but again, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you, Professor Larsens, for your very inspiring presentations. You certainly set the tone for today's discussions, and hopefully we can hear more about your comments later on. Our next speaker on the list is Professor Marie-Louise Sorensen of the University of Cambridge. Professor Sorensen is the founder of Cambridge Heritage Research Center and the leading expert in the field of armed conflict heritage and identity studies in Europe. I'm very delighted to welcome the Professor Sorensen, who will speak about cultural relativity and inclusivity in heritage interpretations.
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm ever so sorry we can't have a coffee afterwards and talk, because that seems to be how humans are. But at least we can start some conversations. I have a few preambles. First, I had to change my title because I had a title a long time ago, and as I started working, I had to change it. But I was told I could talk about whatever I want. Secondly, my slides have, I think each slide, or most of the slides have a picture on them. They're totally irrelevant. They are what I call eye candy. There's something for your eyes to rest on while you listen to me. So I'm not speaking to them. They're just there as a kind of entertainment. And thirdly, I'm very sorry, I will actually be reading my manuscript because I wanted to be relatively precise. So I hope it works. I'm a middle-class white woman from Northern Europe. I was a teenager during the late 1960s and early 70s, and ideas about multiplicality and diversity and inclusion have been around me since I did my PhD and throughout my academic career. These ideas are a comfortable element of how I think about heritage, and to me it seems they have become widely incorporated within heritage management practices rightly. But what struck me while preparing this contribution is how limited that understanding may be. In its assumptions of incorporation, of inclusion, that there is room for all voices, it risks being patronizing, making all voices not just equal, but also similar, and taking for granted the same essential or normative understanding of heritage. Moreover, as we have been embracing multivocality, we have largely focused on meaning, on interpretation, rather than on what constitutes heritage. When applied like that, the idea of multivocality sits, it seems to me, within a Western model of democracy and governmentality that likes to celebrate inclusion, but struggles with exclusionary claims and the idea that some have more or different rights to heritage than others have. It can therefore be proposed that our reflection on multivocality and interpretation has not consistently engaged with a deeper existentialistic and political question of what heritage is and who it belongs to, and indeed whether it belongs to anyone. These are pressing issues, as our traditional notion of democracy and how this in turn have affected official heritage practices and its underlying philosophy and assumption is in conflict with various kinds of bottom-up and indigenous argument about heritage that we are increasingly hearing. To move forward, engage with the diverse political reality around us, as suggests we need to comprehend better that tension or split between, on one hand, a universal value, humankind ideology about heritage, and on the other hand, an identity rights-based one. This difference is real, and it affects not just understanding of heritage, but also its management, including its policing and valuation. How we should understand or react to the challenge that arises from this is not very clear. Multivocality is obviously not a straightforward solution, as different heritage regimes have different positions as regards to the coexistence of different understanding of heritage. However, ignoring the challenge is not possible, partly for political reasons and partly also for epistemological ones, as the two ideologies in various ways tend to undermine each other. Solutions and ways forward may vary and range from creative coexistence, invigorating heritage insight, or it could cause silent mentalities with parallel heritage epistemes. My contribution here does not try to suggest ways forward. Rather, I will aim to further reflect on the reason for the fragmentation of a hegemonic understanding of heritage, seeing that as one of the steps we have to go through towards new types of heritage futures. I think that the tension or differences between a range of emerging alternative heritage ideology are particularly clearly argued through agreements or understanding of what constitute heritage and articulation about rights. So could we see the next slide, please? So just as a point before moving further in, it is very important, and here I have the quote, it's very important here to stress the heritage claim are about something. Although we argued the heritage is a process, it's a contemporary construction of value and meaning and narrative, it is also always about something. And it is in the construction and the relationship, the connection with that something, that the differences between the various alternative approaches that we currently experience in worldwide are most clearly articulated. So I want to point out that underlying the Western generated official regime, there are limitations as well as expectation. It's ideologically founded on ideas of equality, which in turn means that all voices or claims in principle are equally valid and can be scrutinized against the same principles or the same criteria. It can embrace inclusion, including indigenous heritage, but it will strive to maintain a position that all heritage claims shall be on an equal footing and part of a common good. It's also characterized by a particular form of governmentality in which accountability and transparency are expected. And these two aspirations have become growing concerns and drivers. It is focused on participation in the form of representatives, so we have committees and stakeholders. It formulates criteria of evaluation to be agreed to by all within its constituency, and that is to ensure comparability and transparency, and then promulgates further guidelines and policies, and at a national level, even laws. The resulting construction of heritage is a discursive engagement, largely operated through what Laura Jane Smith has termed the authorized heritage course. So the democratic philosophy that sits behind the thing we do actually have certain very typical characteristics. And that heritage is not as an individual right, but rather exists as a common good. It is protected as a duty and involves stewards and guardians who act on behalf of abstract and imagined communities, such as humankind. Heritage as a recognized value resides outside rather than inside people, and it is shared. And this is arguably even the case for official recognized intangible heritage due to its focus on its form. Within this regime and philosophy, it's fundamentally assumed that what constitutes can be widely agreed to and can be confirmed through correspondence with set criteria. I can't see my presentation, but could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So I want to very briefly go back to the idea of common goods assumption, which is sitting very deeply into our heritage criteria. It's about universal, it's the thing which sits behind universal value, and you can go back to John Ruskin and about authenticity, age, original, all adding up to value, and a value which can be externalized and appreciated separate from the human relationship to it. It's also a common good, which are qualities that belongs to everyone, just the same way as roads or schools. It's something we have. It's part of our social contract that we have those rights to that heritage. So could I have the next slide, please? So I just want to further, because I think it's very important that we recognize these qualities that sits behind the notions of universal value, that is a common good one, which is a social contractual relationship. And it is one, if you go to the middle of my quote here, it's a proposition that asserts that people can and should live their lives as citizens embedded in social relationship. It's about a social relationship between citizens and society, and rights and responsibility. And that also means that if we compromise that common good or universal value idea, then we challenge an ideological position on the very nature of society and sociability. So if heritage doesn't belong to all, we do also then challenge our idea about society. Could I get the next slide, please? It referred to notions of entitlement because of, for example, the roles in history, and it's based on identity claims. This makes these claims individual to particular community. They're based on connection with specific history, and they're unique. As a result, they argue for distinct exclusionary relationship. And in this worldview, heritage is exclusionary owned, and there's a bond of belonging between heritage and particular communities. It follows that such heritage cannot be universal, and attempts of including them within universal heritage discourse, for example, as part of multivocality, can appear as an appropriation of their exclusionary rights, insights, and ways of being. It is not unproblematic from an indigenous point of view that we want to embrace them. And such heritage is based on tradition as a way of living. It is argued, preserved, and transmitted typically by elders and by notion of tradition, and it's maintained through narrations, memory, performances, and practices. It is profoundly informed by the notion of a distinct relationship and may result in claims of rights to, as well as over, that heritage. The next one, it was, in many ways, this heritage formation differs from the official heritage discourse that aims at universal or common good heritage preservation. The reasoning and rationale are fundamentally different, and rather than transparency, it seems based on trust, often expressed as respect for the elders or other custodians or traditions. So for example, in terms of UNESCO, we have accountability and transparency, but accountability and transparency in itself suggests a lack of trust. In indigenous perspective, these transparency and accountability are not issue because there's trust. Concerns with equality and comparability are also largely absent or take very different forms, and heritage claims are commonly rectified through the natural hierarchy of communities based, for example, around age or gender or lineages. That's the elders say it is, that's enough. Secret and exclusionary heritage accessible and relevant to only specific members of the community is very common. Exclusiveness enriches the sense of its relevance rather than undermining heritage claim, as equality in the sense of representation or fairness is not a dominant philosophy. Arguable, this form of heritage are internalized rather than externalized, and many customary practices may lead us to characterize this form of heritage as being a kind of embodiment. We may refer to this heritage as a matter of being rather than heritage as a detached discursive process. So very, in that sense, in the qualities of it, that seems fundamentally different from, for example, the authorized heritage discourse. And this one's fine, that's fine. In this one, I just wanted to very briefly give that sense of that there actually are very differently formed notions of rights, that they're articulated through different philosophies, different political regime, but also different ways of understanding beings and your place in the world and your relationship to your environment. So on one hand, we have these common goods that I was referring to, and at the other extreme, we have entitlements to birth rights or moral rights. And we also increasingly seeing what I call alternative, a range of grassroots claims which are in their nature against the establishment. So we have at different level conflicts between claims of universal heritage and various kind of what one might call exclusionary or identity heritage claims. Could I have the next one, please? So the concern to us, and I'm very sorry that my slides was cut, I don't know why. The concern to us, I think, is whether these different heritage philosophies can be reconciled, but also whether they should. Can the official and alternative heritage thinking coexist? Are they too different in the fundamental philosophies, in their ontological understanding of the world, or are they areas of beneficial coordination of ways of thinking? So I think at one level, and that's what I say at the top, I think that for all the systems, there is an issue about that the value of that heritage have to be agreed on to matter. These are not about individual heritage. This is about heritage which belong to group differently constituted. So in some way, one could say that all heritage valuation, whether traditional or HRD or bottom-up, are measures of control, and in that sense become part of authorized discourse. It's an authorized element, maybe even of the indigenous. But the structuration and the reasoning for this become so different that the form of that authorized discourse are not easily comparable. So when heritage construction and heritage thinking follow different pathway and have using very different forms of authority, can they be reconciled, or would reconciliation means that both ways of understanding the world get compromised? I think this is one of the contemporary big challenges for heritage. So I was just lining up where I think there are some of the differences that might be overcome and some which might be too diverse. And then we may be able to find a way of talking about how heritage is recognized and defined. We might be able to find shared way of understanding authority or understand the differences in a constructive way. But I think we are and should be struggling with the difference between seeing heritage as a common good or as universal, as shared, versus seeing it as belonging to a specific group and only to those groups, as an exclusionary view. I think there are also very different philosophical differences between heritage as something which is externalized or something which is internalized, or something which is discursive versus embodied. And there are also some philosophical and political differences between us taking on roles of stewards or whether we see it as custodians. So my last slide is just my thank you. So this is an image from Tokyo, the last slide, sorry, the black one. And I just wanted to thank you very much. And I'm sorry about that. My slides in which I was trying to summarize the differences, both of them were missed. But I hope that it was possible to follow an argument saying that at a deeper level of philosophy and epistemology, there are maybe, or I suggest to you, there are some very fundamental differences between some of the what we see currently as alternative dominant heritage formations, and we do not overcome that difference through claims on inclusions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sorensen, for your very enlightening presentations, and also sorry for the technical problem once again. Our next speaker on the list is Dr. Christopher Young, who is a British historian and archaeologist. Dr. Young has worked closely with the UNESCO World Heritage Center and its advisory bodies for quite a long period of time on various projects, including the revision of operational guidelines of UNESCO World Heritage Conventions. Today he will tell us about balanced interpretations of sites of memory. However, today there has been a bit of problems in establishing online connection with him. Thus we have him on the phone, and although it might be a little bit challenging, we will try our best to put his voice online. Hopefully you can hear him well.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And I'm sorry that we've had these problems with connections, which means I'm having to do this over FaceTime on my phone. But so long as you can hear me all right, that's fine. The conference is focusing on sites of memory, and I wanted to start by thinking that all heritage sites are in some sense sites of memory, since people will each have different memories of each site and perceive different values in it. I have to say, I started my professional career as a very artifact-based archaeologist, classifying Roman pottery. But I've gradually come to realize over my career that in fact heritage is about people and the values that they attribute to places. And I want to start with just two examples of differing values in a site which is not normally regarded as a site with conflict, at least not deep conflict. So looking at Stonehenge, we have an outstanding feature and focus of a ritualized landscape as one meaning. There are those who argue that the whole thing is a prehistoric astronomical observatory of great complexity as a second. And thirdly, we have Stonehenge as a place sacred to modern Druids and New Age pagans who want to hold ceremonies there at least 4 times a year at the major sun festivals, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. Its outstanding universal value is defined primarily as the first of these meanings, although recognizing some link to solar events, and there's almost no recognition of the current and spiritual functions of the monument, but the latter have an enormous effect on how the site has to be managed. So there you have an example of a site where the managers have got to try and manage between those various values. Next slide, please. The next slide is the castle and town walls of King Edward in North Wales. It has a statement of outstanding universal value based on a very early nomination. There are 4 castles built in North Wales at the end of the 13th, early 14th century to secure the English conquest of North Wales and the suppression of Welsh independence. The outstanding universal value sees them as the finest examples of late 13th, early 14th century military architecture in Europe, a unique artistic achievement for their combination of characteristic defensive style and for the beauty of their proportions and masonry, and a major reference for medieval history because their construction is so well documented. On the other hand, they're in the most Welsh-speaking part of Wales, where Welsh is the first language of a large proportion of the population, and they're seen by many of the local residents and by many Welsh as a symbol of English oppression for the last 700 years. Conflict doesn't have to be recent in order to still have considerable meaning and influence on people. So here again, we have a site where there are different meanings and contested meanings, which have to be brought together if you want to get balanced interpretation. And almost any site will have some kind of memorial aspects of some degree or other. Often next slide, please. Often the multiple narratives and the conflicting views are not problematic, but sometimes dealing with multiple values can be very difficult and can cause conflict. And increasingly, heritage sites are seen in communal and individual terms, as we've heard earlier today, and any group, not just professional heritage people, can have views on the values of the site. These values exist because people believe them, and people's views can change. So can that of communities. And because of this, perceived values may change, are not fixed, and they can change as we go along. Also, heritage is seen increasingly as part of the communal national identity so that it can be affected by wider political agendas. And this has led to damage of World Heritage properties, and I would suggest just one example, which is Timbuktu, which I'll mention now. This general view of heritage having importance in modern politics and modern movements, social movements and so on, has also led to focus on objects, particularly statues recently, seen now as symbols of past oppression, whose destruction or removal is now recommended. We have at least one example of that on a World Heritage site in Germany, where it's recommended that a late medieval statue on a church should be removed because it's highly offensive to Jewish people. And it is. So heritage is a political issue, and World Heritage is particularly so. Could I have the next slide, please? One response to contested heritage is to destroy it, and we've seen that. Another is to use such heritage to help the groups and communities involved to understand what has happened in the past. In trying to improve mutual understanding of heritage places, balanced interpretation is a key tool. Because there have been problems with how values of some World Heritage sites are presented, the UNESCO World Heritage Center, funded by the government of the Republic of Korea, commissioned the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience to coordinate the preparation of a study on interpretation of sites of memory. The ICSC is a global network of historic sites, museums, and memorials that is dedicated to promote and protect human rights in different regions of the world, and it is seen as a suitable umbrella body to work on the Sites of Memory report, which was published back in January 2019. The ICSC, next slide please, set up a working party to produce the report, chaired by Jean-Louis Loxon, formerly the Director General of ICOMOS, with me as the rapporteur. And we had a broadly based working party from around the world, so all regions are represented, people working on sites which are very much involved with conflict, projects like that in Cambodia, Guatemala, and so on. People who felt the designation was actually an entire drawback to dealing with sites of conflict. So we have a wide range of perspectives on the site. The terms of reference for the study, next slide please, are broad. We were asked to look at a whole lot of things, and I'm not going to look at most of those this morning. I'm going to concentrate on the points which relate most to interpretation. I'm also not going to talk about technical issues, except to note that modern digital methods make it much easier in practice to present multiple narratives for a site. Because instead of having to produce, at a practical level, large numbers of panels on a site or in a museum with different interpretations of the site, you can put it all on a smartphone and people can look at them all as they wish. There is a lot of guidance, international guidance, next slide please, published by various bodies on how to interpret and present sites of heritage. And I want to look particularly at the ICOMOS Charter on interpretation. Next slide, please, which is based on 7 principles. These, I think, are a fairly good basis for starting work. They're talking about understanding and appreciating cultural heritage, having to communicate the meaning of cultural heritage sites to a range of audiences, safeguarding tangible and intangible values in their natural and cultural settings and social contexts, which comes back to what Peter was saying at the beginning about the UNESCO World Heritage Sustainable Development Policy. Respecting the authenticity of cultural heritage sites, although there are lots of questions about how you define authenticity, contributing to sustainable conservation of cultural heritage sites, encouraging inclusiveness, and developing technical guidelines. And that provides you with quite a good starting point. Next slide, please. But within that, there are also approaches to balanced interpretation, which again involve a series of assumptions. Firstly, that enjoyment of heritage is a right, and that it has a role in the formation of identity. Secondly, that an inclusive approach involves the associated communities and all other significant stakeholders in a site. Thirdly, there needs to be awareness of the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of each heritage site. Fourthly, there needs to be attention to the issues of conservation and restoration. And it's important not to forget, in thinking about interpretation of sites, that you need to preserve the basic material that you're interpreting. And lastly, that all work needs to be based on dialogue, mutual understanding, tolerance, and respect, as far as these can be achieved. Next slide, please. So what needs to be done in practice is to identify all the values of the site, including all memorial aspects. You need to mediate the different perceptions of value using interpretation to bridge differences and to integrate within it reconciliation and even forgiveness. These are not necessarily, well, very often very difficult to do, even on a site which is not associated with recent conflict. You need to decide how you want to raise awareness, disseminate information, and develop educational programs, because frequently you'll find with any site that people who live around it and people more further afield have very little understanding of why it's important in any context. Need to incorporate the material evidence into interpretation and to adopt policies to conserve that evidence. You need to have a research policy because it's very important to keep on researching the site, to see how values change, to see how the research results change the values, and so on. And that needs to include a policy for disseminating the results of the research and sharing them. And better understanding the values of a site needs to be combined with the site's conservation, its educational function, and the local and economic and social development of the local community, which again comes back to what Peter was saying at the beginning. None of this is easy to do. One tool that may help is the concept of the four truths developed by the ISCC, because truth about a site will appear differently to different people, groups of people and individuals, depending on their state of knowledge and their perspective of understanding of that site. I don't think there is such a thing as absolute truth. Any narrative is an interpretation of the known evidence for it. Could have and the ISC definition of the four types of truth is useful in this context. So official truth is the public and official acknowledgement or denial of what happened. Narrative truth is the narratives told by victims, witnesses, and perpetrators. Social truth is established through public interpretation among all stakeholders. And healing truth is the truth which helps repair damage and prevents the recurrence of civil violence. These four truths reflect very much ICSC's primary role, which is trying to develop reconciliation at sites of conflict as part of a wider peacekeeping and development approach. But you can translate those four to almost any heritage site as to how you do it. And it is a useful tool to think about. So, just to finish, I want to talk a little bit about balanced interpretation needs, what these are, on my last slide. And these are inclusivity, research, negotiation and discussion, willingness to change interpretation as understanding of past events change, testing and capacity building, educational programs, use of the material evidence as key supportive interpretation and conservation of that evidence, and use of appropriate media to communicate with all concerned. That is a very practical set of needs and is based very much on the approach of a heritage professional or a group of heritage professionals in the working party, most of whom had spent their lives trying to actually manage heritage sites and interpret them, and having to deal on the ground with what should be done. And there, I think, I should probably finish because I must have used my time by now. But thank you again very much for the opportunity to speak on this fascinating topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for your very informative presentations. The heritage interpretation is a field without much of guidance or clear methodology. but your presentation has given the idea of ways we go forward. I would like to hear more about your comments during the open discussions. Now we will have a 5-minute break, during which we will share with you a short video clips. This year marks 70th anniversary of the Republic of Korea's admission to UNESCO. So we have prepared a short video clip as a small part of our celebration. So hopefully you will enjoy these video clips.
In June 1950, the Republic of Korea became the 55th member state of UNESCO. Unfortunately, only days after joining, the Korean Peninsula suffered the outbreak of war. In the aftermath of the conflict, UNESCO offered Korea hope for a brighter future.
In the aftermath of the Korean War, Korea was in desperate need of help from the global community. At that critical moment, UNESCO provided the country with precious aid in the form of primary school textbooks. The generous support by UNESCO and other UN agencies enabled a whole generation of Korean children, including myself, to continue their education in the face of great hardship. This is how, in Korea's darkest hour, UNESCO gave us hope for a better future.
The seeds of peace planted by UNESCO 70 years ago helped Korea to grow into a prosperous democracy. Over the past decades, Korea transformed itself from a recipient of development aid to a significant donor. Today, Korea is a key partner of UNESCO, and together, we aspire to change the world for the better. Korea is an ardent defender of equal opportunities for education and growth. We partner with UNESCO on its Global Citizenship Education Initiative, empowering learners to become responsible global citizens.
대한민국은 아시아, 아프리카에서 또 다른 교육의 기적을 꿈꾸는 나라들을 돕고 있으며 세계 시민교육과 지속가능 발전 교육 등 미래 세대에 꼭 필요한 교육 의제를 선도적으로 이끌고 있습니다.
Korea is a dedicated supporter of UNESCO's efforts to preserve the natural, cultural, and intangible heritages of humanity for our future generations. UNESCO has taught us that the heritage of war and division can turn into a strong foundation for future peace. The historic joint inscription of traditional Korean wrestling, Serum, as a UNESCO intangible heritage, marked an important step toward peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. We hope that the demilitarized zone, currently a symbol of the division of the Korean Peninsula, will one day become a heritage of humanity and a powerful symbol for peace.
And UNESCO is determined to do all it can to support the path towards lasting peace on the whole peninsula. But I'm also thinking of the demilitarized zone, which today is a symbol of division, and that could become a space for peace and cooperation for nature and biodiversity under the label of UNESCO. This would send a strong message of hope, not only to the Korean Peninsula, but also around the world.
Korea aims to strengthen its partnership with UNESCO in order to face future challenges together. We firmly support UNESCO's important initiative to establish a common global foundation of ethical principles in the field of artificial intelligence. We stand together with UNESCO in our response to the global coronavirus pandemic. And we will make every effort to counter hate and discrimination in this time of crisis.
70 years ago, Korea became a member of UNESCO to join in the efforts to build a world where peace is firmly built upon the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind. 70 years later, that aspiration remains our guiding light. We believe that strong solidarity is the only way to overcome global challenges, and all the more so in this time of an unprecedented global health crisis. As a committed member, Korea stands ready to continue contributing to UNESCO's founding cause, advancing international peace through education, science, and culture.